Okay, thanks, Catherine. Well, I think absolutely everybody in this hall was absolutely appalled and outraged when the revelations, wish it had been a revolution, but the revelations broke on Sunday night that not only were protesters and campaigners who were campaigning against the racism of the British National Party and justice for the Lawrence family in the early and mid-90s, not only were they spied on by the police and there was an attempt to discredit them and to criminalise them, but also that the Lawrence family themselves were spied on by secret police. So whilst the Lawrence family were grieving for their son, who had been cut down at a young age at a bus stop in Eltham in southeast London, they were grieving for their son, but rather than the police investigating and carrying out inquiries and an investigation to bring his murderers to justice, they were actually spying on the family and investigating the family themselves and doing everything they could to discredit the Lawrences, their friends, the rest of their family, and the protesters and campaigners that were attempting to support them at the same time. And as the revelations snowballed, this week, we found out on Tuesday that Dwayne Brooks, who was Stephen Lawrence's best friend, who was witnessed the murder, was there when Stephen was murdered at the bus stop in southeast London. Dwayne Brooks himself was dragged through the courts and they attempted to discredit and criminalise Dwayne Brooks. And the same policeman that spied on the family and spied on Dwayne Brooks also spied on Youth Against Racism in Europe, which was the organisation that I was the national chair of, and also on the Militant, the forerunner to the Socialist Party, which was the organisation that set up Youth Against Racism in Europe. Now, the purpose of this police spy was to set up special branch files on the activists in Youth Against Racism in Europe and in the Militant. In all, he set up 30 special branch files. So I now have a special branch file on me, other activists have a special branch file on them, and yet I have never been brought before a court for criminal activity. I have never been charged, I have never been cautioned, and yet there is a police file on me. And that is on top of all the other revelations about female protesters who had relationships with police spies, who fathered their children, who came into their homes and lived with them for several years, but all the time they were living a double life. Or police officers that stole the names of dead children as part of their undercover operation. And what we've had this week is the crocodile tears and the measly words of David Cameron and Boris Johnson and the Home Secretary, who say it's terrible, it's appalling what has happened. And we have had to remind them, and we are not going to let the Tories, and for that matter, the likes of Jack Straw and the Labour government that did exist, not now, but the Labour government up until the last election, we are not going to let them rewrite history, because we set up the campaign, the YRE, the Militant and other activists and campaigners in South East London. We set up the campaign in 1987 to close the British National Party headquarters, and we petitioned and we lobbied Bexley Tory Council and the police to use their powers to close down the BNP headquarters. We warned that if they were allowed to be active in our community, it would lead to racist attacks and could lead to racist murders. And the Tory Council refused to act. They said if you ignore the British National Party, they will go away. And what we had instead was politicians, the media and the police combining together in a campaign to discredit anti-racist activists in that part of South East London. And the crucial point, I think, that we have to make as trade unionists and as socialists is that this wasn't a rogue unit of the Metropolitan Police. This wasn't a rogue policeman that overstepped his brief. This was policy. This was policy to criminalise protests and to discredit mass democratic anti-racist organisations which existed in the early and the mid-90s. And the other thing we have to put on record is actually, despite everything that this policeman who spied on us and his friends, because there's 5 others that we don't know about, that actually he wasn't successful in what he attempted to do. We were successful. He wasn't able to wreck our movement. We succeeded in building a mass youth organisation across the country really, but particularly in South East London, which pushed back the activity of the British National Party for a decade, and we succeeded in closing down the BNP headquarters. So he wasn't successful, and actually some people have called this spy the spy who loved us, because what we also achieved was we won him over, actually, or so he says. He witnessed the police brutality against protesters, particularly on the big demonstrations which we organised in Welling against the BNP, and he said, well, actually, the YRE and those in the militant were very, very brave, and I ended up having some sympathy for their cause. So he was, in fact, the spy who loved us. And the point I made about this not being a rogue unit, you see, it was policy then to criminalise protests, but of course, as we know, that process is still continuing, and the kettling and the vicious police brutality of student protesters over recent years shows that it is policy to criminalise protests. Now, what is it that we're calling for? There's been lots and lots of discussion this week about the sort of inquiry that we should have, and there are currently 16 inquiries into police brutality, police spying on protesters. There are 16 inquiries. The 2 main inquiries, one is the police investigating the police, and the other inquiry is being held in secret courts. And we, as trade unionists, as activists, we have to demand quite clearly, and we have to campaign for this, we want a fully open, democratic inquiry which involves all of those people that have been spied upon, all of those people that have suffered police brutality on protests. We want the Lawrence family and the other justice family campaigns to be involved. We want protest groups, and we want trade unionists, because as trade unionists, we all know the regular spying that goes on of our activities, the blacklisting of trade union activists, of particularly those in the building trade and so on. So we want a democratic, fully open democratic inquiry involving all of those organisations. And if we don't get that, then we should organise our own inquiry in order to investigate everything that's gone on. And we want to, and that includes actually investigating the role of politicians, because I just don't buy it that Jack Straw knew nothing about the Special Demonstration Squad, because Jack Straw was Home Secretary for most of the time of the last Labour government, and the Special Demonstration Squad was not disbanded until 2008. So we want to know what politicians knew about the activities of the Special Demonstration Squad. We want to know about where the orders came from. We want to know about the role of Sir Paul Condon and the rest of them in terms of their involvement in giving the orders for these spies to go in, spy on protesters, but also to spy on the Lawrence family and their friends and supporters. And just to finish, comrades, because I've been told I've got to stop speaking now, but this is about an assault on our democratic rights, and the right to organise, the right to belong to a trade union, the right to protest, the right to speak freely about the ideas that you believe in were hard-won rights. And on the way to this meeting this morning, we drove past Canning Town Town Hall, where the early trade unionists who were campaigning at the beginning of the last century for the right to organise, where they met and organised, and there's a plaque that talks about the right to organise, the right and the right to free speech and the right to assembly. And therefore it's been a hard-won right, and it's not one that we are going to give up lightly. We are going to campaign for the right to protest, the right to organise, and to do that freely without state spying and interference. We've called a demonstration on Tuesday, July the 9th, outside Scotland Yard. So put that in your diaries now. We want to unite all those that have been victims of this type of police harassment to come onto that protest, to start campaigning for openness and the sort of public democratic inquiry that we want. And we're going to be organising lots of protests over the next few months. Protests against austerity and cuts. We'll be organising our own Taksim squares, our own mass civil disobedience against the bedroom tax. And we want to know that we'll be able to do that free from state interference and free from spying. And all of our campaigning over the next few months has to go hand in hand with a struggle to defend the right to protest and the right to organise.